He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Nau mai, haere mai, kia ora and welcome along to the Music 101 interview podcast. I'm Charlotte Ryan. I host the flagship music show each Saturday afternoon on RNZ National from 1pm. You can always tune in live or go to our website, or alternatively, subscribe to this podcast to hear the best interviews of the week that I do. And today's interview is no exception. I promise you, after this chat, you will want to know more about this documentary and potentially the book too. We've spoken about Prince a lot on Music 101, but that's because he's one of the few superstars that is still surrounded by so much mystery. Even after his death, there's so much that seems unexplained. He was so private. He did very few media interviews, but yet he released so much music. And it's the music and the lyrics that we can hear his story through. There is a new edition of a book called Prince, The Man and His Music. Originally it was released in 2012, but since then it's been called by so many as the definitive book on Prince. And yes, now author Matt Thorne has re-released it. He's expanded it, acknowledging the many unreleased songs that the Prince estate has been releasing, but also, of course, acknowledges his New Zealand tour and also Prince's death. Matt Thorne kindly agreed to speak to us. He knows how many New Zealanders are such Prince fans. But there was one other conversation I wanted to have with Matt about Prince, and I knew he'd have the goss on it. Have you heard about this new Prince documentary? Well, apparently it's 9 hours long, and the reason why people are talking about it is the documentary's been completed, interviews were done, all the stuff from the archives was drawn out, amazing performances we've never seen. However, the Prince estate have now said Netflix is not allowed to release the documentary. Even more mystery surrounding Prince. I knew author Matt Thorne would know details, so I couldn't wait to speak to him. And when he called from his home in London, of course we started off asking about his book, Prince the Man and His Music, and why he decided to re-release it.
I mean, it was kind of a slow process. I mean, so the book initially came out in 2012, which was 4 years before his death. And I couldn't really sort of shake him off, really, even though, I'd sort of finished the book. I was still paying attention to everything. I mean, I wrote the book as much as a critic, also as a fan, so I was really plugged into the Prince world following that, and I was writing articles for the newspapers and magazines about him as well. But the thing that really sort of made me want to sort of update it was realizing that I didn't really capture the end of his career. And there was that very important tour, the Piano and a Microphone tour that you had in New Zealand, as well as elsewhere around the world at the very end, that I really wanted to write about. And it felt really odd. I mean, I often find that with music books or books about anybody, really, that when somebody writes about someone shortly before they die, and then there's a missing bit at the end, you always feel a sort of sense that it's not quite finished. And I was sort of holding off. I was kind of waiting until there was a massive sort of change in the estate, or so, some sort of extra kind of conclusion. And I realized that I don't think anything more will happen now, which will change his story.
Can you tell us anything you know about those Auckland shows, those New Zealand shows that Prince performed not long before he died? They were, for me as a Prince fan, I still mourn the fact that I didn't get to go. The tickets were hugely expensive, and if I'd known it was his last shows, I would have found the money.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
Yeah. What did you find out about them?
That was an interesting one because when Prince did the shows over here, the 21 Nights, sort of quite a big kind of famous event where he played 21 nights at the O2 in London and then played all these after shows as well. I'd met a couple of women who were over from Auckland, and we just spent the night talking about Prince, and they knew I was writing a book, and it was really interesting. And then when my book came out, one of them wrote to me and said that they'd been at that show and seen that show on the Piano and the Microphone tour. And she'd really noticed a sort of sadness in Prince and how he was changing some of the lines and some of the things that he was saying at that show that were different to the way he normally performed songs. So that's gone into the book. I also listened to a kind of audience recording. I mean, I listened to as many audience recordings as I possibly could throughout the book. I mean, there is this thing with Prince that in order to understand him, you have to listen to unofficial recordings, you have to listen to audience recordings and unreleased albums. And, there's a huge kind of sort of shadow side of Prince's music that you really need to listen to understand him. And so I listened to a recording of that show, connecting it to the things that I'd been told about that show. And I could really hear that. It was an interesting time for Prince. It was shortly after Denise Matthews, Vanity, one of his early girlfriends, and the woman that he originally wrote or partly inspired Purple Rain, the film, although somebody else, Apollonia, played it in the actual finished film, but the original role was written for Denise Matthews' Vanity. And she died around that time, and he played a few songs that night in New Zealand that he hadn't played elsewhere in memory of her. Also, it was around that time that David Bowie had died, and that was had a big impact on him as well. So it was kind of I mean, I saw over 100 Prince shows in my lifetime, but I always want to have seen others, But from the recordings I heard, it did seem a fairly dark time for Prince, and he was sort of talking on those shows, not in New Zealand, but in a subsequent one in Australia, I think, where he was asking the audience if things were as dark in the universe where they lived as he felt they were in America. So he was clearly, in quite a melancholy mood at that time. And as you know, I mean, those shows were a piano and a mic called Piano and Microphone because it was just him with his piano and a microphone. And they were sort of autobiographical shows because he would play. The shows changed over the tour, but essentially the structure of the show was for him to tell his sort of autobiography in a way. And he was starting to write an autobiography that sort of he never got to finish, but did come out and complete. But he was turning that show into kind of an autobiography. So he'd start off playing the first songs he'd learnt with his father's piano. It was sort of the Batman theme and the Munsters theme and the Addams Family theme. And then he would talk about his life and he would play songs sort of chronologically through his career. But as always with Prince, when he started doing a tour, it changed and the idea became different and he did lots of different things that night. But it did seem that in New Zealand, those two shows he did there, I think it was two in the same night, he was being very revealing. He was sort of showing a side of himself that he never got to or never previously had shown, and I think probably would have shown more of had he lived longer.
That's so interesting. I'm so fascinated how you work on trying to understand Prince and his personality and what's going on in his life through his song lyrics and his performances. And is that because he's so reserved, or he was so reserved? He didn't really do interviews.
Well, basically, with this book and with all the kind of music writing I've ever done and I'm doing in the future, I try and go in as many different directions as I possibly can. So I always start with the artist, and I did write to Prince, and that's what started the book. Was he invited me to a party in his house where he played live, and I went there and I was standing there with David Duchovny and Sharon Stone and all these celebrities and just watching him, and he just walked out and started playing. And at the end of the show, I said to it was amazing. And I said to his manager, I said, well, what does this mean? And he said, well, Prince does that. He likes people writing about him, but he doesn't necessarily want it to be intrusive. He's read some of the articles that had appeared in the paper. I had quite a few articles about him that he liked, some that he put on his website. And he said, so it was saying it's sort of a sign of approval. And he said, but I wouldn't interview anybody if I were you. So I started writing the book from that perspective when I was listening to his music and primarily trying to understand him through his songs. But then by chance, I had a friend in LA who was friends with Wendy and Lisa, and he said that they were ready to tell their story and they'd never told their story before. So I thought, I can't pass up this opportunity. It's too important for the book. I can't, I'm going to have to sort of disobey Prince in a way here. And so I went over and I talked to them, and they opened up their address book, and I interviewed all the sort of people from that important period. And then having done that, I thought, well, I can't just have that period well covered and not others. So I started tracking down and interviewing people from as much of his life as possible. But the thing about Prince is that there are periods of his life where it was only him and possibly two other people around who were doing work, So sometimes there are very few accounts, and there was literally no record of all of this period. A lot of the time people say, oh, Prince is mysterious, you don't understand him. He did reveal so much in his music. He was somebody who wrote a song nearly every day. You get a real insight through listening to his lyrics. He's a very autobiographical lyric writer. He almost always writes about himself. He almost always, he'll, mix relationships together and he'll change things. It won't be, but he's really surprisingly direct. And quite often in the second or third verse of a song, you'll find him really sort of being very truthful in a surprising way. So, you can't not analyze the music. And that's sort of one of the things I find disappointing sometimes about other music books, is that they don't get into the lyrics. And I think with Prince, it really was in his work. So much of it was, and but it was there in the songs he wrote, but it was also in what he was saying to people in the audience that night. It was also what he was saying to the other people who were working around him. I did talk to his managers and his confidants and his girlfriends and, absolutely everybody who was prepared to talk to me. But each of those people saw a different side of him, and you need to sort of try and put it all together, and you can have all these different perspectives. But you're right. I mean, the other thing you said about he wasn't a particularly good interviewee, there was one occasion. So after he invited me to his house about 4 or 5 years later, because I worked on the book for 7 years, he invited me to a show in New York in the Hotel Gainesville. And in the middle of the performance, he came over while playing his guitar and said, "How about that interview?" And of course I said, yes, and then he sort of danced off and disappeared, and I never saw him again for the rest of the evening. So, I mean, I would have loved to have sat down with him. But that said, there aren't really any good interviews with Prince. All the interviews with him, he's very cryptic.
Yes.
He doesn't really, I mean, they're fun to watch, particularly the TV ones, but he never really says much about, he always had that mantra of the rear view mirror is broken off. So he didn't want to talk about the past. And so when I'm writing a book like this, I wouldn't have been able to sit down with him and say, "What were you thinking about when you were writing that song?" Because he wouldn't have told me. But if I talk to the other people who were working on that song with him, then they may have more of an insight. And also, he wrote thousands of songs and wouldn't be able to remember everything that he wrote about each song. Whereas a lot of the people who worked with him worked on him for 10 songs or 20 songs or around for a short period. So it's kind of a mosaic and putting it all together. And that was sort of how it worked, really.
I love it. If you've just tuned in, I'm speaking to author Matt Thorne about his book, which has just been reissued, Prince, The Man and His Music. There's so much talk always of the archives and the vault, Prince's vault. But the thing that I am very intrigued with, that I've heard whispers about, is a supposed 9-hour documentary on Prince. Can you tell me anything about this?
There's currently a conflict between the Prince estate and Netflix over this documentary. The reason for the conflict between the estate and the documentary maker is that they don't really like the way that Prince is presented in that documentary. And I have to say, I haven't seen the documentary. I know a few people who were interviewed for it. But I have to say that it's not a situation where I immediately say, this should come out, this should definitely come out. I mean, we all like the idea of a 9-hour documentary. But it does seem from reports that have mainly been in the press and a few interviews that it's got quite a negative way of looking at Prince. And it also seems as if the director is trying to psychoanalyze Prince. So the way I understand it is that you see some footage and you hear songs, and then you sort of see the darker side of what led to those songs. And some of the interpretations the estate don't agree with. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, I don't want to say there's a lot of negativity, but I think maybe I think the best way of putting it, as far as I can understand without having seen it, and obviously I'm speaking without having seen it, is that there's an attempt to psychoanalyze Prince, and there's an attempt to resolve him as a mystery, and there's a particular solution that's presented as this, as resolving the Prince mystery that the estate don't like. I've got some sympathy with the estate here. I mean, that is their job. Their job is not to allow people to present a negative portrayal of Prince. I mean, there's lots of different sides to this argument. There are fans who just want to see it, because it's like, great, 9 hours of Prince. There are fans who desperately don't want to see it because they don't want people, or they don't want it to be released because they don't want the general public to have a negative view of Prince based on watching this documentary. The musician Questlove, in one of the interviews, said that he was shown it and then afterwards had to go and see his therapist because it was so disturbing.
Oh.
And the idea of how Prince was presented was so contradictory to his own vision of what Prince is like. But from what I understand, a lot of it is about the loneliness and isolation of creativity and how Prince's parents might have had an impact, or his sort of domestic situation as a child may have had an impact on the music that he subsequently created. Now, I mean, there's some truth to
I'd agree
all
with
of
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a way of presenting Prince that is darker than the reality. And what I've tried to do in my book, in kind of comparison to something like that, was to always think about how Prince would perceive it and not try to psychoanalyze him beyond what's actually there. The other thing, I suppose, is that the documentary's made after his death, and the manner of his death means it's always going to have a darker kind of current. And one of the things when I was revising this book and adding to it was that I didn't want to go back and look at his whole life from what was possible, seems an accidental death. It wasn't something he wanted to happen. It was, it was painkillers. It was something where he got the wrong painkillers and he died. That to me isn't that doesn't nullify anything in Prince's career. And it doesn't make anything he did negative. And I think you can go through his story and see it as a sad story, but equally it's one of the most joyous stories that ever existed. He had an incredible life. He created an incredible body of work. He was so generous. He did so much for his fans. He gave so much to everybody. And I think the idea of a documentary that casts him in what sounds like a negative light doesn't seem to me to tell the whole story. As I've said, I haven't seen the whole documentary, so I may be, out of line on that. But they're definitely one of the people who is in the documentary, John Bream, who's a journalist in Minneapolis who followed Prince throughout his whole career. He wrote a piece about how he had misgivings about the way he was interviewed. So he felt that they were sort of digging for a kind of negative perspective, or at least a kind of trying to say, because Prince, had a kind of quite a combative relationship with this journalist, and he would throw him out of events, and he would, and he would sort of make fun of him and things like that. And the director and the producers were presenting it to him like, this must have really upset you, and this must have really annoyed you. And he was just like, oh no, it's fine. That's just who he was. That was his character, And I think that's the thing that I think can get lost in all this. And maybe, the director, as I understand it, wasn't a fan particularly, and was coming to try and find a narrative in this.
Well, exactly.
And I think if you look at this,
I was going to say yes, exactly. If Netflix is behind the project, they want clicks. They want people to watch it. They're looking for that headline, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, I don't know. There's also this thing about, well, would it have a lasting impact on Prince's legacy or not? But I think it probably would, sort of a 9-hour Netflix series that had a kind of melancholy or kind of negative cast on his career. A lot of people who don't know that much about Prince would watch that and go, oh, that's what that guy was like, whereas I don't think that's the story that's out. As I say, dozens and dozens of people, a lot of people were frustrated with him or found him annoying or felt that he hadn't, that he'd worked with them and then disappeared and moved on. But I wasn't getting lots of people who were really upset. I was getting lots of people saying the time I spent with him was the greatest part of my life and I'll remember it forever. So, obviously, I can weave that into a story. I can give it context. If you had a documentary where it's just people being interviewed and they're all saying Prince is great for 9 hours, that probably isn't very dramatic and interesting. So I can understand the reasons why they've done it, but I don't know. I'm torn on it.
I bet. Matt Thorne, you're always so wonderful to talk to about Prince. And yeah, well done on the reissue. It's going to be a perfect Christmas present or anything for any Prince fan or someone that wants to learn more about Prince. You have gone into such details on the songs. Can I ask you to pick a Prince song now, Matt? Which, as I imagine for you, it will be so hard to pick a Prince song because the catalogue's so massive.
Can I have two? Is that possible? Is that allowed?
Yes, I'll make that allowed.
Okay, because I want to have one for just what I think is Prince's greatest personal achievement, and that's the song Crystal Ball, because it was so ambitious and so adventurous. He recorded it shortly after Sign the Times, I believe, and and it's got a 40-piece orchestra. It's about 10 minutes long, but it's still really funky and really, a really great song. And this just sat in the vault for years and then came out. Prince had an album called Crystal Ball, which actually had it on later in the 90s. But that's the one I think Prince considered it his finest work himself and thought it was the best thing he ever recorded. So I have to have that. But the one I would have, if I was DJing and wanted to put a song on and get everybody onto the dance floor, it would be Erotic City, which is, my absolute favourite song of his.
Matt Thorne, thanks so much for the chats.
Lovely to talk to you too.
I was speaking with author Matt Thorne about his book, Prince, The Man and His Music. The second edition, the revised edition, I should say, is out now in New Zealand bookstores. I do believe it's selling very, very quickly, though, because I've tried to find a copy myself. So maybe phone bookstores before you go in and get it. But in terms of music, listening-wise, if you're a Prince fan, you don't need me to tell you what to listen to. I'd say the album Purple Rain, but I'm also really enjoying these new singles that the Prince estate are releasing. And make sure you listen to the lyrics in each song in the third verse, as you heard Matt talking about. That's when Prince divulges even more personal information about himself. I'm out of here. I'm back on the radio each Saturday afternoon on RNZ National, rnz.co.nz. But until next time, take care. If you like this podcast, make sure you follow it and forward it to any Prince fans that you think might like a listen to.